In 1957, on a point of land in coastal Maine, an amateur digger named Guy Melgren lifted a small silver disc out of a Native American settlement and mistook it for a worn medieval coin. 20 years passed before anyone realized what it was: a Norse silver penny struck in Norway 4 centuries before Columbus. It had no business being there. Nothing around it explained how it arrived. How does a coin minted on the far side of the North Atlantic end up in a coastal Maine trading camp? Who carried it across an ocean that, as far as the history books were concerned, no one was crossing yet? And why was it the only thing in that soil that pointed east? This was not a lost tourist pocket change. It was a single, genuine, datable fragment of the medieval Norse world, sitting where it should have been impossible for it to sit, and no one has ever fully explained how it got there. To weigh what that means, we have to start with what the site actually was, and what the people digging it expected to find. The place is called the Goddard site, on Naskeag Point near the town of Brooklyn, on the central Maine coast. When professional archaeologists finally examined it, they expected an ordinary story, a modest seasonal camp, the kind that dots the entire New England shoreline, where a local Wabanaki community came in the warm months to fish and hunt seal and sturgeon, then moved on. Nothing about the location suggested anything more. But something here was wrong, and it showed up in the artifacts. This was not a small local camp at all. Out of the ground came somewhere around 30,000 objects, and the stone they were made of did not belong to Maine. There was chert from Labrador, hundreds of miles to the north, a distinctive translucent stone that comes from exactly one place on Earth, a single bay on the Labrador coast. There was pottery of a type usually found as far away as New Jersey to the south, and Nova Scotia to the east. There were worked pieces of copper. Whatever the Goddard site was, it was not a quiet family fishing spot. It was a hub. Material was flowing into it from 1,000 miles of coastline in every direction, and that scale is the first thing that should make you lean in, because it changes what a single foreign object found there could possibly mean. And there was one more oddity, small but strange. Unlike nearly every other major coastal site in Maine, Goddard had almost no shell midden at all. The one feature archaeologists most expected was the one thing that was missing, as though this place had been used differently from every settlement around it, for reasons no one has settled on. A trading ground rather than a dinner table, a place people came to exchange and then move on, leaving behind a scatter of objects from impossibly far away, and one object from impossibly far away in the wrong direction entirely. Because here is where the ordinary explanation begins to fail. Everything else at Goddard, the Labrador chert, the New Jersey pottery, the copper, all of it moved along a coastline. It could travel hand to hand, community to community, one canoe journey at a time, without anyone ever crossing open ocean. A stone can pass through 50 pairs of hands over 2 centuries and end up 1,000 miles from where it started, and nothing about that requires a miracle. But the silver penny could not have started anywhere on this continent. It started in Norway, and somewhere between a Norwegian mint and a Maine trading camp, that object had to cross the North Atlantic. And the moment you accept that, the whole comfortable picture of a purely local trade network quietly breaks apart in your hands. The coin itself is not in doubt, and that matters because a story like this lives or dies on whether the central object is real. For a long time, skeptics wondered whether the penny had been planted, a hoax salted into the dirt to fool the archaeologists, so the coin was tested. Decades after its discovery, researchers examined it using a technique that reads the chemistry of corrosion, the slow changes a metal undergoes across centuries in the ground. The results showed corrosion consistent with the coin having lain flat in the earth for a very long time indeed, water trickling around it season after season, the wear and staining matching genuine long burial rather than something recently pressed into the soil. The penny was not faked. It had lain in that ground, in that position, for centuries, and its identity is precise. It was struck during the reign of Olaf Kyrre, King of Norway, who ruled from 1067 to 1093. That is not a vague medieval date. It is a specific window, late in the 11th century, and it places the coin's creation within living memory of the one thing that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine historical problem. because at almost exactly that moment in history, we now know for certain that the Norse were not only capable of crossing the Atlantic, they had already done it. They had already stood on North American ground. And the proof of that was pulled out of the earth just a few years after Melgren found his coin hundreds of miles to the north. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, arrived at the northern tip of Newfoundland, chasing a theory that most serious scholars considered a romantic waste of time. The old Norse sagas, written down in Iceland in the 13th century, told of voyages westward across the ocean to a land they called Vinland, a place of timber and wild grapes and good pasture, reached by sailing on from Greenland. For centuries these stories had been treated as literature, as myth dressed up with real names. Ingstad believed they were describing a real coastline. Guided by a local fisherman to a series of overgrown ridges near a fishing village called Lensog Meadows, the Ingstads began to dig. What they uncovered ended the debate. Beneath the turf were the foundations of 8 timber-framed buildings built in unmistakably Norse fashion, with turf walls and long central hearths. There was a smithy and evidence of iron smelting, the first known ironwork in the New World, along with a bronze cloak pin of Norse type, a stone spindle whorl, and iron nails. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement right around the year 1000. This was not a legend anymore. It was the physical proof that Norse seafarers had established a base on North American soil roughly 5 centuries before Columbus, exactly as the sagas had claimed. Lansog Meadows remains, to this day, the only fully authenticated Norse settlement anywhere in the Americas. So consider the shape of what we now have: a confirmed Norse presence in North America around the year 1000, and a genuine Norse coin struck a few decades later, found in the ground of a Maine trading hub. 2 hard facts, both dug out of the earth within a few years of each other, sitting several hundred miles apart on the same eastern seaboard, and between them, nothing. No trail, no second coin, no Norse building in Maine, no grave, no smithy, no nails, just the 2 endpoints of a line that no one can prove was ever actually drawn. That absence is the whole problem, and it is worth sitting with because it cuts both ways. If the Norse themselves had sailed into Penobscot Bay, you would expect them to leave more than a single coin. They left a whole settlement in Newfoundland, dense with the debris of daily life, while in Maine there is 1 silver disc and nothing else. That silence argues against Vikings ever standing on that particular shore, and yet the coin is undeniably there, undeniably real, undeniably Norse. The evidence refuses to resolve into a clean answer in either direction. It simply sits there, a fact without a story, and waits. But the ground at Lonsor Meadows held one more clue, and it is the detail that keeps this question alive when it might otherwise have died quietly. Among the remains at the Norse settlement, archaeologists found the husks of butternuts. Butternuts are a species of walnut, and they matter enormously because the butternut tree does not grow in Newfoundland. It never has. Its range in that era lay hundreds of miles to the south, down toward the valleys of what is now New Brunswick and beyond, into the warmer country to the southwest. The Norse at Lonsor Meadows did not find those nuts locally. They carried them back, which means the people at that settlement did not simply stop at the northern tip of Newfoundland and stay put. They travelled south, into regions where butternuts grew, and returned with them. The one confirmed Norse foothold in the Americas contains, buried in its own kitchen waste, the proof that its people ranged far beyond it, into exactly the kind of southern coastline that leads, eventually, toward the Gulf of Maine. Nobody knows how far south they went, and that has to stay the honest answer. The butternuts prove range without proving a destination. They establish that the Norse explored a coastline warm enough to grow walnuts, and nothing more specific than that. But they change the texture of the question. Before the butternuts, a Norse presence anywhere near Maine was pure speculation. After them, it becomes something harder to dismiss, a documented pattern of southward exploration from a confirmed base, pointed in exactly the direction where, some decades later, a coin from their world would turn up in the dirt. So who carried the coin? And how far did the people who dropped those butternut husks actually travel? What would it have taken for a Norse voyager to reach the Gulf of Maine? And if one did, Why would nothing survive of the visit but a single coin? Or is the truer answer quieter and stranger and harder to picture, that the coin travelled without any Norseman ever touching Maine at all? Because there is a second explanation, and most archaeologists who have studied the site consider it the more likely one. The coin did not need a Viking to carry it to Maine. It needed only the trade network that the Goddard site itself proves existed. Remember what came out of that ground: stone from Labrador, pottery from New Jersey, material moving across more than 1,000 miles of coastline. That northern reach matters because Labrador is not far, in the scale of these things, from the waters the Norse were working out of Greenland and Newfoundland. A Norse coin, small and light and easily carried, could have entered that indigenous trade network at its northern end, passed from a Norse hand to a native one somewhere in the far north, and then travelled south exactly the way the Labrador chert did, hand to hand, community to community, one exchange at a time, over years or decades, until it came to rest in a trading camp on the coast of Maine, as far from Norway as a small silver disc could possibly drift. And there is a physical detail that supports this reading, one small alteration to the coin itself. At some point in its life, the penny was pierced, a hole made in it of the kind you make when you want to string an object and wear it. Whoever possessed this coin along the way did not treat it as money. The Norse monetary system meant nothing in Penobscot Bay. To them it was an ornament, an exotic and beautiful foreign object, valued the way the copper and the translucent Labrador stone were valued, for its rarity and its strangeness. The piercing is a quiet, human detail, and it argues that the coin passed through the hands of people for whom it was a treasure precisely because it came from somewhere unimaginably far away, somewhere none of them had ever seen. This is the interpretation the evidence supports most comfortably, and honesty requires saying so plainly. A single portable object, moving through a documented trade network over a long span of time, requires no ocean voyage by anyone the coin ever belonged to after it left Norse hands. It is the explanation that demands the least and strains the fewest facts, and it is very probably correct. The coin most likely came south the same way the stone did, carried by people who had never seen a Viking and never crossed open water. And yet the question does not fully close, and it is worth being honest about why. The trade network explanation is the most economical, but economy is not the same thing as proof. No one has ever traced the coin's actual path. No one has found the intermediate points, the other Norse objects that a long down the line trade should, by rights, have scattered along the way. The coin arrives in Maine as cleanly and inexplicably as if it had fallen from the sky, and the trade network, however plausible, is a reconstruction after the fact, an argument for how it could have happened rather than evidence of how it did. The most likely story and the proven story are not the same story, and the gap between them is exactly the size of the thing we do not know. So let the bolder possibility stand on the table for a moment, carefully and labelled clearly as what it is. We know the Norse reached North America. We know they sailed south from their Newfoundland base, far enough to gather walnuts that grew hundreds of miles away. We know a genuine Norse coin, struck within a lifetime of that settlement, ended up on the Maine coast. It is possible, not proven, not demonstrated, but possible, that the line between those points was shorter and more direct than the cautious explanation allows. That a Norse keel did, at least once, cut into the waters of the Gulf of Maine, and that the coin is the one small thing that survived the visit. The careful reading says the coin drifted south through native hands. The bolder reading says someone brought it. Neither can be ruled out, and the evidence, as it stands, cannot choose between them. What makes the bolder reading so hard to simply dismiss is that the sagas themselves describe more than one voyage. The Norse accounts of Vinland are not the story of a single landing. They tell of repeated expeditions, of a coastline explored over several seasons by different crews, of encounters with the native peoples they called Skraelings, of trade and conflict and retreat. If those accounts preserve, however imperfectly, the memory of real voyages, then the Norse were not a single ship that touched land once and vanished. They were a recurring presence along an unknown length of coastline for an unknown span of years. The sagas are not a map, and they were never meant to be read as one. They are memory shaped by generations of retelling before anyone wrote them down. but they describe exactly the kind of sustained exploratory contact that could, at its southern edge, have brushed against the world that the Goddard coin came from. Oral tradition and written saga are legitimate historical sources, but they have to be weighed with care, not treated as proof of whatever we wish they showed. The sagas confirm the pattern that Landsort Meadows confirms in the ground, Norse seafarers on this coast exploring southward over time. What neither the sagas nor the soil can tell us is whether that exploration ever reached the specific stretch of water where a pierced silver penny found its way into a trading camp and then into the earth. So return, one last time, to that point of land in Maine and to the small silver disc lying flat in the dirt where it had lain for centuries. Around it, 30,000 objects that travelled the coastlines of a continent. Above it, no Norse building, no Norse grave, no second coin, nothing at all to explain it. And to the north, a confirmed Norse settlement whose own kitchen waste proves its people sailed south toward warmer country, toward walnuts, toward the direction the coin would have had to come from. Is that a coincidence? It might be. A single coin is a thin thread to hang an ocean crossing on, and the cautious explanation, the slow drift through native trade, remains the most defensible one. Skeptics point out, correctly, that one object proves contact between the trade network and the Norse world, not necessarily a Norse ship in Maine waters, and that extraordinary claims are not built on lone artifacts. Those objections are sound, and none of them have been fully answered. But taken together, the pieces describe a shape that a single piece never could. A confirmed presence, a proven reach southward, a genuine coin at the far end of that reach, and a trade network vast enough to move it, all wrapped around a question no one has managed to close. We do not know, with the certainty the historical record would demand, whether any Norse voyager ever saw the coast of Maine. That claim remains, and should remain, an open question rather than a conclusion. The coin came to rest in a place where a Norse coin should not be, and the most that can be said with confidence is that it got there somehow, across an ocean, in an age when the crossing was just barely, provably beginning to happen. Everything past that is interpretation, and some of those interpretations remain genuinely unresolved. That is not a flaw in the story, that is the story. Guy Melgren lifted that coin out of the ground in 1957 and did not know what he was holding. The Ingstads uncovered a Norse settlement in Newfoundland 3 years later and proved the impossible had already happened. And somewhere between those two discoveries lies a question the evidence sharpens without ever answering, whether a coin in Maine and a settlement in Newfoundland are two ends of the same voyage, or two separate facts that only look like a line because we so badly want to draw one. The settlement in Newfoundland eventually went quiet. The Norse gathered their tools, boarded their ships, and sailed back the way they had come, leaving 8 turf houses to sink slowly into the bog. The trading camp in Maine went quiet too, in its own time, the point of land emptying out, the objects from 1,000 miles of coastline settling into the soil to wait. 2 silences on the same ocean's edge, a few hundred miles and perhaps a few decades apart. One of them holds a coin that came from the other's world, and the water between them, which carried whatever it carried and kept no record of the voyage, has never once offered to tell us which story is true. Thank you for watching. If documentaries like this one, built on physical evidence and the historical record held to the same honest standard, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. And before you go, I want to ask you directly, do you think that Norse coin drifted south through hundreds of years of Native American trade, hand to hand, until it reached the Maine coast, or do you think someone carried it there themselves and left nothing else behind? I'll see you in the next documentary.